There we go.
Welcome. My name is Marjorie O'Toole, and I am the Executive Director of the Little Compton Historical Society. I'm going to do less than a minute of business before I introduce tonight's speaker. As many of you know, we are in the middle of a multi-year project that we are calling the Sakonnet History Project. As we enter 2025, this will be our main public-facing year of the project. We're going to have many events for you to attend. I hope if you're not already on our mailing list, our physical paper mailing list, you will contact the office. Christine will put the phone number for the office and her email in the chat and ask to be added to our mailing list. Please watch our social media. We also have it's called MailChimp. It's like a email server. So there's lots of ways we can communicate. We want you to know about all of the programs we're going to be having. Most especially, please save Friday, June 27th as our exhibit preview party from 6 to 8 p.m. It's a wonderful event. We expect about 400 people to attend this year, which is our maximum. So we may sell out. Tickets will be available in May. And invitations will go out in May to those of you for whom we have addresses. And you can always contact us and ask for a ticket if you are not already on our mailing list. So with that being said, tonight's event, and Christine said earlier, we've been looking forward to this because the work behind this talk took place in 2023. So, and it was one of the first really important things we did concerning the Sakonnet History Project. And Kevin will be talking about the belongings, the Sakonnet belongings that are in our collection and in private collections all throughout the community. So tonight, we welcome archaeologist Kevin Smith. Kevin has 50 years of experience. He did his graduate work at the University of Michigan. Much of his time working as an archaeologist has been at the Buffalo Museum of Science, the Haffenreffer Museum in Iceland, which is an area of particular interest of his. Most recently, he is a principal at Osprey Heritage Consulting. And as such, he was a fabulous consultant and partner and buddy for us as we began the Sakonnet History Project and started to learn about the things left by our historic Sakonnet residents. So, Kevin, welcome, and please take it away.
Thank you, Marjorie. It's been wonderful to work with you and with everyone there at the Little Compton Historical Society. It's great to see so many people who are interested and for some of you, this is going to be quite new. For some of you, it's going to be old hat. For some of you, you're going to see some of the objects that you've collected over the years in some of the pieces. But I've tried in this presentation not to call out any individual collectors or collections and really to focus in on what we know about the deep history now of the area, which we're going to call Sakonnet, meaning Little Compton, the adjacent parts of Tiverton, and the Westport River. Marjorie, I'm going to try to share my screen at the moment, and let me know if you see it so I can be sure that people are seeing what I want them to see. Yeah?
You're all set, Kevin.
Perfect.
Great.
Thank you very much.
And I'm just going to interject one other thing. Kevin will be taking questions at the end of his talk. If you have a question, please put it in the chat feature. And at the end of the talk, Christine will read those questions to Kevin. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I wanted to start off by just saying, how did I get involved? And Marjorie already gave that a little bit of that background. We talked, Marjorie, it was either at the end of 2022 or early in 2023. And we had known each other for a bit of time because some material at the Little Compton Historical Society had come from the Haffenreffer, where I was deputy director, and we had worked on trying to get that back together. In late 2022 or early 2023, we had a meeting at which Marjorie explained that she was looking at the 350th anniversary of English settlement in what is now Little Compton, and really wanted to look at what was possible to do to talk about how far back people had lived there. And basically also what was it in the Little Compton Historical Society's collection of a small collection of archaeological material, just about 69 objects at the time, to find out what, frankly, what you would be able to say, what she would be able to say in an exhibit about the Sakonnet people. I know one of the questions to begin with were these objects, which had come over the span of 50 years into the museum, frequently with very little information about them, were they even local? Did they have any relevance to Sakonnet Point, to the Sakonnet people, to Little Compton, or were they potentially things which had been accumulated on trips to other parts of the world, other parts of the country, acquired through antique shows? So what was really there? And I felt honored to be asked to come in and take a look at them and see what there was. And I could see very quickly in the 69 objects, there was a fairly nice and interesting group of pieces. Now, before I get into that, I really want to say a little bit about the kinds of ways that we talk about history in this area. And in particular, the history of New England Historical Society, or the history that New England Historical Societies typically preserve and present, begins with the arrival of Europeans around 1620, and European explorers a bit earlier than that, about a century earlier, with Verrazano in the region, and it continues to the present day. In this image, this little red box represents the 400 years of European settlement in the area, starting with Plymouth and up to the present day. The oldest of us among here fall somewhere before World War II. But this is basically the history that animates most historical societies, and almost 90% of the history, maybe 99% of the history that is taught to our children in schools around New England. Now, the vision that they have, if they're taught at all about Native American history or Native American culture, really fits into this period of 400 years before. And it presents very beautiful paintings such as this, which have complete veracity with regard to what we know about the nature of life here in the late 15th and late 16th and early 17th centuries, when European explorers began to write down what was there, frequently disregarding what native people told them, but beginning to build a picture of it. And in the 25 years that I've been in Rhode Island, I would say the majority of people who came to the Haffenreffer Museum with objects that they had found in their backyard or that they wondered about, more than half of them really thought that native history in this area probably extended just about this far back. A short period of time before, they might have heard some stories other ways in archaeological literature that things go back farther, but for the most part, the vision was of a fairly short time span, or that the time span didn't matter, because the vision they had of the way Native people lived, according to those records from the 17th century and late 16th century, was pretty much an eternal timeline, that this is how it had always been, that there wasn't much change, that Native people had lived in a state of nature with the world around them, and that there really was nothing to be considered history. In fact, with each of these 400-year blocks, you begin to get a sense of the actual duration of the history of our area, with that red dot at the top being the history of most of the people in this room. European and African American histories represent less than 4% of this region's actual history. And because the Wampanoag and other Native communities are still with us, vibrant and expanding and enjoying a renaissance in many cases today, this area's history is 100% theirs, and 4% or less is our own history that is told in most historical societies. As archaeologists, we divide this same timeline into a number of periods: Paleo-Indian, early Archaic, Middle Archaic, Late Archaic, Terminal Archaic, the early Middle and Late Woodland, and the Contact period. And I'll be referring to those time periods as we go through this talk tonight. And we as archaeologists understand that these are artificial breaks in a continuum of development over the span of at least 13,000 years in the eastern United States, and perhaps as long as 22 to 23,000 years in much of the United States, based on recent research done by a number of my colleagues and friends in New Mexico, and that's beginning to really help us to understand the larger period. In New England, there's only so far back you can go, because about 16,000 to 18,000 years ago, where you are sitting and where I am sitting, not where I'm sitting in central Pennsylvania, where I am at the moment, where most of you are sitting in the Sakonnet region, was under an ice sheet that extended all the way out onto the current continental shelf, from there north to Greenland, and from the Atlantic seaboard all the way to the Rocky Mountains, where it joined another one. So we know that there is little chance of a prehistory before that, unless it's very, very much before that, and was probably erased by the glaciers as they moved through. There's not going to be a quiz after this, but I just wanted to give you a sense of, as we begin to look at these different periods, these are the dates based on the most currently available and well-structured dates that we get from radiocarbon dating. And what I wanted to really point out primarily here is this last column on the end, which talks about the duration of each of these periods. So these periods are based on a number of ideas that archaeologists came up with back in the last century, when pottery appears, when various different things appear. But as we break the continuum down, the periods are of different times. So when I show you later on reconstructions of the number of objects per over time, I've statistically normalized them so that we know that if the late woodland contact period is much shorter than, say, the early Archaic, we're not just comparing them one-to-one. When I do this, because we're working with collections that people have made as they've been walking fields throughout the area, or with collections at the Historical Society that sit on a shelf, we have not recovered them archaeologically from stratified archaeological sites with attached radiocarbon dates. So as I go through the presentation I'm talking about the ways in which we're dating these objects are based on their styles. And here's an example of a stratigraphically a stratified site from out west, but it shows you that in each of the different layers as you go down, there are different styles of projectile points. And across the northeastern United States, there have been a vast number of well-documented, well-excavated sites that help us to provide dates to the individual objects that we look at. It's not all that easy to do, though, because stone tools of the type that we're able to use as, if you will, type fossils of different periods in time also have their own history through their creation and through their use. Stone tools are sharpened by taking flakes off of the edges of them. And so as you take an object and begin with a full preform, as you can see on the left, which is when you're flaking it out and beginning it, you come to a projectile point, but as you use it, you flake more and more pieces off of it, so that on the right-hand side, you can see 3 different types of projectile points, which look very different in the course of their use life, as they get shorter and shorter and stubbier and smaller from their original form. And so it really takes working with these for a very long period of time, seeing tens of thousands of these and working through the archaeological literature to be able to see points at different stages in their lives, if you will, artifacts at different stages in their lives, and be able to identify what period they come from. There are also questions that people often raise about these types of objects. Are they unique to specific communities? And the answer is rarely. Most of the projectile points that are found in Narragansett Bay in New England are found across New England, the lower Great Lakes, the mid-Atlantic. Some of them in the earlier periods of time have similar styles of points that go all the way across the United States or out to the Mississippi River region. And so we know from that people were connecting, they were communicating, they were using the same styles over vast regions. But the raw materials from which they're made can be tied to specific geological formations or region. So by combining style or the type of the tool and the raw material, it allows objects to be tied down not only to regions, but to periods in time. It's also been common for archaeologists, especially in the 20th century, to assume that every point in time was represented by a single type of artifact. And so frequently, even today in New England, you'll have debates about the small-stemmed point people versus the Susquehanna people. Did they live at the same time? Were they in the same communities? Were they side? And it's not really that easy to be able to say that you can associate an individual point, just like on this cartoon on the side, or like so many old Western movies where the person looks at the arrow point and says, this is Sioux, this is whatever, to be able to identify it to a period or a time. This became really apparent to me when I was a graduate student going into graduate school, and I had a chance to work in the northern tip of Alaska. And believe me, this will get back to Sakonnet in a moment, but it's the how we know what we know. And I had a chance to work on an archaeological site from the late 19th century, early 19th century as well, of an Inupiat Eskimo village at the northern tip of the United States in Barrow, Alaska, now renamed Utqiagvik to its original name. And that area had been documented in the 1880s by ethnographers who had come there, and they identified all of these different objects here, which would be, if found individually in an archaeological site here, identified quite likely as a projectile point, an arrow point, a spear point, etc. All 11 of these were in use at exactly the same time. These were all used for hunting whales, seals, and walrus. These are the ends of thrusting spears used against land mammals. The one to the very far left is a man's knife, different from a woman's knife, and only these two at the bottom, one of which is made out of stone and would be preserved in the eastern United States. Those are the only arrow points, and the only reason the one is made out of stone is because it was used for hunting humans and bears only. So there are very specific uses for these, and we can assume quite likely throughout most of the eastern United States at different points in time, different types of stone tools that look like arrow points or spear points were in use at the same time. And luckily we have enough work done across the area that we can begin to pull those apart. So I've given you a little bit of the background of how we look at these and why Marjorie asked me to come and do something, but what did we do? We started, as I said, with the Little Compton Historical Society's small collection of 69 objects. And it was immediate. This is just a small grouping of them, obviously, but there was a diverse number of materials. They were cataloged and nicely organized, but the data was very rough that came along with them. In some cases, there was a little bit of information where they might have come from. In many cases, they were just there. We knew the name of the donor in some cases, in other cases, not. They'd come in for almost 50 years, and they had been peripheral. I think it's fair to say, Marjorie, I hate to put words in your mouth, but peripheral to the former mission and vision of the society. They weren't forgotten, but they weren't really used. There wasn't a clear sense of how to use them. And as we began to do the work, 19 more were added while we were on the project from some collectors who, I guess, heard about what we were doing and were inspired to add them to the collection. The initial questions that I was asked to think about were, are any of these realistically local objects, are any relevant to understanding the Sakonnet people or the Historical Society's mission? Were any of them acquired through the antiques trade? How much time was represented? And how representative was the collection at all of this area's pre-colonial past? And as you can see, there are a number of different objects from, I don't know if you can see the cursor, but ceramic shards at the bottom, a metal projectile point here, a whole series of different stone tools, pestles, groundstone axes. Groundstone axes, pestles, we can only associate them to broad spans of time, but the projectile points give us a very much tighter range. And when I say tight, we're talking within the span of 500 to 2,000 years. So not always, really down to a level that would have made sense on a human scale. But it was an interesting group of material. We started off by thinking about what the raw materials were, because if these were not at all to be found locally, it began to tell us that these had come in from people who'd gone out to the West to the Mississippi Valley. When I worked at the Haffenreffer Museum, we found that a large number of the pieces that were supposedly local had actually been collected in Kentucky, Missouri, other places like that. And we had to untangle that. So that what we found here was only 2% were materials that were unknown from New England collections. 74% were from raw materials found right in the Narragansett Basin, in some cases right in Sakonnet Point or in Tiverton. Another 16% came from the Boston Basin, where there are a series of ancient volcanic outcrops that provide rhyolites and hornfells and a series of other materials. 8% were what we might call exotic. They came from distances of more than 100 miles away, maybe up to 250 miles away. But they were types of stone which are well known in local collections and types which we know moved into New England through trade connections and the interpersonal connections that people had at different points in time. And only 2% were unlikely in any sense to be related to this region. And that is actually a single object. And even by its style, we knew that that was from the Midwest and had no part in this area and probably came in through the antiques trade, somebody acquiring it, somebody gave it to somebody because they knew that they were interested in Native American objects, belongings. And so as we began to look at, again, this small group, most of them were local types. There were some real surprises, things that I did not expect to see. There were some things which were questionable. In the upper right here is an object which is the tip of a stone spear point that would have been probably 9,000 years old, but the raw material is from Western New York. And it was unclear initially what that might be. And were we going to see any more of that material called Onondaga chert in local collections? And the one at the bottom right is this one, which is clearly about 1500 AD from the Ohio River Valley, made out of raw material that's from Indiana and is probably almost certainly here as something that someone had collected. What we found is that the collection of the Historical Society spanned at least 7,500 years. And based on the frequency of the different types of objects found in there, there were at least two periods that seemed to be extremely well represented, the late Archaic and the late Woodland or Contact period. But we really didn't know, because the collection was so small, whether this was representing something general across Sakonnet Point, across the Sakonnet region, how it related to the large archaeological sequences in New England, or whether it was just a function of this was only 69 objects. Fewer than that were stone tools that we could identify to periods of time. And they probably came from only 2 or 3 areas where people had collected. So they could represent a number of different things. The earliest periods, the Paleo-Indian and early Archaic periods, had a couple of objects that maybe if you looked at them in the right way, in the right light, and had more information, maybe they dated to that period of time, but it really wasn't clear that we could be sure of it. So we knew right away that there were some interesting questions. The collection actually did represent something about the region, and it did have patterning in it, but we didn't know exactly what that meant. And it did suggest that the area now known as Little Compton or Sakonnet did have an archaeological record that clearly went back at least 7,000 years, but what it meant beyond that, we weren't sure. We began to look into some depth in a few of these objects that were so unusual and so unexpected that we really wanted to be sure about them. We started off with this copper axe, which if I had seen it in a collection that had no documentation where it came from, I would have been convinced that this had come from somewhere else. In this case, we knew the person who had collected it. We knew when he collected it, where he collected it in the town of Little Compton, and we were absolutely certain it came from there. We used X-ray fluorescence, which is a non-destructive analysis, using basically that ray gun that's standing on a stand on the left-hand side. The work was done with the help of Steve Lubar and people at the Haffenreffer Museum. They did the analyses and sent me the numbers. And it became clear that this object was almost entirely pure copper with just 0.5% tin as a trace element. Now, that small amount of tin and the absence of any other metals really indicates that this is native or naturally occurring copper. rather than a smelted copper alloy such as brass or bronze, something that would have come from Europe. And the primary sources of native copper that were used in North America in the pre-contact period came from around the Lake Superior Basin, had been mined there and turned into objects for at least the past 7,500 years. So here we see where it was found, and here we see the area where the sources are. And in fact, the areas that have a fairly small amount of tin and nothing else come a little bit to the east of where that big green dot is on the southern shore of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We can't tell the exact source, and it would be great to do another analysis of it with a bit more instrumentation, but it's pretty clear it's from this area. More information about this piece is related to sites that were excavated in the 1930s in New York State, particularly the Robinson site, which is a Laurentian, late Archaic Laurentian Puritan phase. It's the type site for that, where they found a copper celt or axe, just like this. And it is virtually identical in size, in shape, in weight to this one. And similar copper tools really are diagnostic of this Laurentian tradition, the Brewerton phase, which has been radiocarbon dated to 4,500 to 5,000 years ago. And so putting that together, we immediately began to see that this one object's life history may not have gone through the Robinson site, but certainly came from the eastern part of Lake Superior, through the hands possibly of many different people along the way before it arrived in Sakonnet Point. But we also can't rule out the possibility that people from Sakonnet Point 5,000 years ago were traveling that far into the interior. We don't necessarily know what these objects meant in their societies, except that they do not appear to be specifically like a axe that was used for cutting down trees. They are more likely to be status emblems, and they're fairly significant pieces. There are very few of these copper tools from New England, and most of them were found in earlier periods and are not well documented to where there are. But there's a very large copper axe up at the Robbins Museum in Middleborough, which was found near Chatham, I believe. And so we know that they're in this area. It is an unexpected thing to see locally and a really amazing thing to see locally. But it is not something which is normal, but it is telling us about the connectivity, the interconnections of people 5,000 years ago in this area. Another one we did that we looked at again with X-ray fluorescence was this piece, which is often called either a trade point or a kettle point, because it's often considered that these were cut out of trade kettles, brass or bronze kettles that were traded to native communities and cut out and used to make arrow points. And in this case, we could see it's a composite copper alloy incorporating a range of different recycled metals, lead, iron, antimony, nickel, silver, titanium. But because neither zinc nor tin are identified in it, it cannot be from a brass or bronze kettle. This is clearly an early modern copper alloy that was intended to be sold here, made in Europe, and was intended to have a reddish or copper hue rather than the golden appearance of bronze or brass. And that suggests that it was really intended very much for trade with native communities for whom the color symbolism attached to copper as a red material was extremely important, and we will see later was also important in the late woodland and contact period choices of stone that were used. And that it was not given a golden hue, which for most of the coastal Algonquian communities and the Iroquoian communities in the eastern United States was a color associated with sickness, with bile, with a whole series of negatively valued things, which is one of the reasons it was hard to give gold to native communities, but copper was the most valuable material in many communities at that time. And so if we look at this, we see that in the 1620s to 1670s, we've got connections coming all the way across the Atlantic. Without going into detail, this is another one. This is a heavily resharpened Fox Creek stem point that was found in the area around Fogland in southern Tiverton. It's from the Middle Woodland period, and the raw material here is it's called Pennsylvania jasper from the Hardyston Formation in the Delaware River Valley, showing us yet another connection being made to this area around 450. So even the small collection from the Little Compton Historical Society immediately showed us 7,000 years of activity in the area and also began to unlock a series of stories about mobility, connectivity, showing that this was not an area that was just isolated or peripheral to the world at that time, but was connected. Having looked at the Little Compton Historical Society's collection, we wanted to expand the frame and move on beyond there. And there were a number of ways to do that. One of them was to work with the Public Archaeology Laboratory's Sakonnet River Survey to go back to the literature of what kinds of archaeological projects had been done in the area before. That survey was done in 1984. It really focused on the area around Nonquit Pond, with a brief survey down the coastlines of the Sakonnet River, and that provided us with a sense of what was known to that point. I contacted and worked with Charlotte Taylor at the Rhode Island State Historic Preservation and Heritage Commission, looking at site files and reports to see what else was known from the area, so that we could begin to get a sense of how what was really known for the region. What really was known for Little Compton itself was extremely little. And I worked with the City of Boston Archaeology Laboratory, which has a wonderful source collection of lithic raw materials from mostly the Boston area, but throughout New England, that allowed us to really identify specific materials in collections to their origins. The archaeological sites that were documented in the Sakonnet River Survey Project of 1984, or that had been identified in the Historic Preservation and Heritage Commission's records, really show up as these open circles on the side. And you can see, if you look at the key, these are all linked to individual periods of time. And most of what was known was from up in the area around Nonquit Pond and what is Peckham's potato fields and the Sepauwett marshes, with only a fringe of objects of material known from around the borders of Little Compton, the shorelines. And the white pieces down at the bottom are from the Historical Society's, the state archaeologists' records, but they are all sites that were known without any diagnostic objects, so they could not be put into any periods of time. So we knew people were living on the coast. We didn't have any idea what was going on in the interior. When we looked at where the pieces in the Historical Society's collection came from, there were very few that could actually be tied to specific locations, but those that did allowed us, in combination with what was known prior to that, to begin to develop a slightly better sense of what was going on in Little Compton in the Sakonnet region, and to be able to demonstrate that beyond these coastal periods and beyond this material that was up around from Sepauwett to Nonquit, there's a scattering of material, especially from the later part of prehistory, and possibly one Paleo-Indian object found in the interior of Little Compton. And not surprisingly, as it turns out from the geology and the nature of modern land use, the eastern side of Little Compton, as well as of Tiverton, are really poorly known because you don't have a lot of plowed fields there. You don't have a lot of people who are actually walking those fields and seeing what might come up when the plow comes. And I should say, all of the material, with one exception that we looked at, came from objects that had been turned up in plowed fields, so they're already disturbed. These are not from archaeological sites that were excavated. Some of the ones that were done by the Sakonnet River Survey in 1984 were excavations, but the objects we were looking at were not. So we knew we were not getting into habitation sites or grave sites or others that had been disturbed. We were looking at things that had already been kicked up by the plow, and we were able to try to put them back into some context. The next phase of what we did were a series of community collection assessment days. And we invited people to come to the Wilbur House and to bring their collections and share them with us so that we could look at them and give them information on what the ages of the objects they had were, and to actually begin to record those at the Historical Society so that we began to build up a profile of what was known to collectors in the area who had in some cases spent most of their lives walking local fields or had inherited these collections from their family members. We had 2 full-day sessions with at least 20 collectors. These meetings lasted from 20 to 60 minutes, and Marjorie, I think some went even a little over that for some of the collections. We photographed and recorded what they had. People were extremely generous with their time and their knowledge. They provided us with information on the age and composition of their collections. We gave them that, but they provided us with information on where they found them, how they went about doing the collecting they did, how they learned about those spaces. We made sure we did no appraisals, no discussions of value, because this was not what it was about. And we also tried to encourage people to think about the ethics of collecting, that what they are finding may be being disturbed, but it is the record of that site and ultimately should be recorded and ideally provided to a museum where in the future it can be a record of what was found at that site. All of us know, thankfully not so much in Little Compton, that much of Rhode Island and southeastern New England has been paved over. Places that were fields in the past, places where people had lived, are now underneath yet another Walmart, yet another Citizens Bank, yet another Dunkin' Donuts. And so these archaeological sites are endangered resources as well. And the record of what came off of those fields is an important thing to be preserved for the future. As we did, as we gathered geographic and contextual information, we asked them, where did you collect them? What led you there? That information was also added to the Historical Society's records, and they helped to also document changing landscapes, because the landscape we see today isn't exactly how it was in the past. And here's an example on the right. The purple dot is a Middle Archaic site about 7,500 years old, where a local collector had collected a number of pieces. And based on what we know about the ways in which sea level rose after the end of the Ice Age, when this site was occupied, it would have been at least 1/3 of a mile away from the local stream and probably more than 4 miles from the coast at the time. So what we see it today as a coastal site would not have been that at the time in the past. It helps us really to think about change through time, and also changes about what we cannot see because of areas that are underwater now. We also went to a number of very large and impressive private collections and looked at those. We spent full day or half day visits with these major collectors, reviewing and documenting their collections, did interviews with them. And again, these were almost all, and with one exception, surface collected objects, not excavated material. And really fantastic large collections, and for the most part, extremely great memories about where the material came from. We could never get down to the individual aspect of what part of a specific field were each object found in, especially things that had been found 35 years ago, but almost always to the field, the region, whatever. It allows us not to get down to the where in a site was it found, but it allows us to really begin to build a picture across the region of where people were living in the past. We documented more than 2,000 objects, over 1,100 of which could be assigned to periods based on their style. We were able to identify biases in collectors' decisions about what to collect and especially where to collect. For example, we found most collectors were not collecting broken pieces. They weren't collecting all the flakes that came off. They were very few people. I think we found no collection that had any ceramics. Only one collection that had the steatite objects you see on the side here, which are fragments of stone bowls. So we could begin to see that individual collectors had areas that they liked to go to, that they knew that people had gone to before. There were some locations that everybody goes to. Some locations people are pretty sure no one else goes to, but we know that they do. Some that are unique, some that are just on their private property. But we also found that there were many sites and locations that were unrecorded in the files of Rhode Island State Archaeologist's Office. And we're building a profile that was new and different. We also learned, if you look here at the red bars on the side, those represent the number of objects per 1,000 years period in the Little Compton Historical Society's records. And you can see there's a slight peak in the late Archaic and the late Woodland periods. It's earliest to the left, most recent to the right. And when we looked at all of the rest of the collections that we saw and normalized them by time period, this does represent somewhat the same pattern that we see across the region as we looked at all the rest, which allowed Marjorie and I to be able to look at the Little Compton Historical Society's collection and say, yes, it provides a somewhat representative picture of the peaks and valleys that we see in what other collectors are finding. But based on the small size of the collection, it's limited in scope because there was much more to be seen in private collectors' collections. We also could see from this that there was evidence of a dynamic history of changes through time in, if not the number of people living in the area, the number of objects that were being lost, dropped, forgotten, thrown away, that has something to do with the way the land was used, certainly, and probably with the number of people living here at the time. And it talks about periods of fluorescence and periods potentially of decline, resilience, duration, and continuities. We also learned, though, that it really matters how these different styles are dated. So, for example, these little white quartz points that you see here, there's a debate within the archaeological community about whether they all date to the late Archaic. If so, and you put them in as late Archaic points, you see a massive peak in the late Archaic, and by the terminal Archaic, which comes right after it, there seems to be a massive decline. If, on the other hand, it seems possible, these were used in both of these periods, then looking at them representatively by the amount of time spent, and you divide them among those two periods, it instead seems more like that terminal Archaic period was one of the fluorescent periods in this area. And then you see a decline. So there are uncertainties in the way this goes. There are a lot of things still to be learned from the archaeological record that will change the way we understand the record of a place like Little Compton or the Historical Society's collections as we go down the line. It gets us to the question of what patterns did we see in the past? What comes out of this when we try to look at the history, long-term history of the Sakonnet region, and how far back does it go? The oldest material we found actually dates to the Paleo-Indian period. It's these two objects on the left-hand side where you can see at the bottom side of each of them, there are a series of flakes which are struck from the bottom going north or going up towards the top. These are what are called fluted points. They're the preforms actually to make fluted points, which are the diagnostic objects of the Paleo-Indian period, which begins about 13,500 years ago and goes to about 11,500 years ago. And I'm just gonna, this is a time at the end of the Ice Age when there was still a late Ice Age climate. It was considerably cooler in this area, but it was warming rapidly following the last pulse of intense cold during what's called the Younger Dryas period. Sakonnet Point, the Sakonnet region at that time would have been an open spruce and birch woodland with grasslands in between, a lot of low shrubs, incredibly good grazing land for especially extinct megafauna, animals that no longer exist in this area. Mammoths, stag moose, which was like a giant elk with moose-like antlers on it. Beaver, the size of a black bear. The short-faced bear, which was a long-legged bear about the size of a horse. And we know from work that was done in New York State that because of these large animals and large animals dying on the shoreline as well, California condors were also living in this area. So a very different world than what we would have seen in the present day. These fluted point preforms, based on the raw material used and some aspects of them, seem most likely to me to be of a type called Cormier Nicholas, which would put them at the end of the Paleo-Indian period, but I've been working with colleagues looking at them, trying to think more about them. They may be earlier, which is why we can say it's likely that Little Compton, the Sakonnet region, has a prehistory that goes back at least 13,500 years ago. But certainly, even if these are at the end of that period, at least 11,500 to 12,000 years ago. This fits into a larger period locally when we begin. When we begin to look at the Narragansett Basin as a whole, these Cormier Nicholas and late Paleo-Indian diagnostics, looking at other regional collections, there are really two clusters of these. One around the Norton Reservoir, just across the border in Massachusetts towards Bridgewater and such. Another around the Riverside region. These may well be the focal areas of two different bands or places that were used at different times, but they seem to be really strong connections. It's important to realize that these areas, even the ones in what's now the Riverside region, and into Seekonk and Warren and Barrington, this was not where the sea was at the time. The shoreline, 11,500 years ago, is where those yellow lines are at the bottom there. Would have been almost 15 miles to the south of the current shoreline, and the sea was 250 feet lower at that time. So all of these areas, including Little Compton or the Sakonnet region, where we've documented now for the first time Paleo-Indian material, would have been well inland on upland areas overlooking what now is called the Sakonnet River, but at that point really was just a river, not an inlet of the sea. And in this period, we see a heavy use of local raw materials. What we've not seen yet from Sakonnet are any really obvious early Paleo-Indian materials, which are almost always made from really high quality cherts that are found outside of the region. Following this, we had a surprisingly large number of objects from the early Archaic period. Now, this is one of the periods which across New England was considered so rare that for many years it was considered that no one lived here throughout this period. We've now gone back and looked at a lot of collections and seen that's not the truth. This was a period after the end of the Ice Age when it became quite a bit warmer than the present time and drier, but extremely seasonal, so that the summers were much hotter and drier than this time. We see a lot of evidence in the bogs and in the paleoecological record of forest fires. Think a little bit about California recently, very dry conditions, soil being blown away and forming into almost dunes in much of the eastern United States. So warmer and drier summers, but extremely cold winters. It has to do with the tilt of the earth and how these things change at the end of the Ice Age. This is a period when we began to see deciduous forests, deciduous and coniferous forests, pine and oak primarily, replacing those late Ice Age landscapes. And with them came modern fauna, deer, elk, bears, etc., rather than Ice Age species. Caribou had also been a really important part of that landscape in the Ice Age, and there's some evidence that caribou continued in this area for a while. In fact, there were mountain caribou still in the White Mountains and into the Maritimes into the 18th and 19th century. But for the most part, you would expect to see pretty normal, what we would expect as a fauna in this area. There's evidence that the rivers would not have had a lot of fish because the rivers were still readjusting. They were creating their current boundaries. They were rushing, they were meandering, they were fairly raw, and we think there weren't really very large riverine fish populations at the time. The communities that we can see from work done across the eastern United States, these were people who were focused on hunting and gathering. They were fairly mobile, but there was a big focus on the wetland, and in parts of New England and New York State, especially around the Mashantucket Reservation, and in eastern New York, where there have been excavations, there's evidence that at least in some areas, these were semi-sedentary communities that were excavating large house floors into the soil, into the ground, creating semi-subterranean houses that were occupied and reoccupied over the space of generations. So this is a really interesting period when we would have expected perhaps to see very highly nomadic people, but we're seeing instead evidence of potentially really, really tight adaptations, a focus on these wetlands that would have been really like the supermarkets of their time, a place where you could sit on the shoreline of a newly developing wetland, open water rather than just the swamps that we see today with swampy margins, being able to reach out with one hand to all the resources of a watery environment, migratory waterfowl, whatever fish there were, amphibians as they began to come into the area. And on the other hand, to be able to go straight into the woodland. So you'd have all of the things that you needed at your disposal. The number of pieces that we've found from this period is really unusual. It has been thought for a while that much of New England, we couldn't see this early archaic record because, as I said, at one point it was viewed that no one lived here. Later it was considered that maybe, and there's still some consideration of what's called the Gulf of Maine tradition, which was thought to be communities that worked without these types of stone tools, projectile points, had a much more probably more organic material based material culture, fewer chipped stone tools. I wonder to what degree that isn't based on how many pieces have been taken off of surfaces by collectors, or the degree to which maybe in those big sites where you're living for a period of time in these houses, you have a different range of tools that you're using, because we are seeing really the complete sequence that you'd expect to see on the left-hand side there of the types of stone tools found all over the eastern United States from the beginning of the early Archaic to the end of the early Archaic period. And again, putting this into context with what we know from the Narragansett Basin, the size of the circles here basically just represents increasing numbers of stone tools. And this is from the very first half of the early Archaic, the part that's really poorly known for the most part or recognized in southeastern New England. And we can add into that what we now know from Sakonnet Point. And in fact, you can see the size of those dots. It means that what we're seeing here is actually one of the larger concentrations of early Archaic material at the very beginning of the Holocene epoch. When we see this later part of the early Archaic, when people are making these sort of bilobate points that you see at the bottom, which are called bottom left, which are called bifurcate points, these are fairly well recognized by most collectors, and they're easy to see in collections. We don't have nearly as many of them from Sakonnet Point. So there's some changes, as we can see across the landscape, that these, over periods of time, are changing in where people were settling and where they're hunting, where they're doing their work, and therefore where the objects are being deposited. Following this, as we get into what's called the Middle Archaic, about 9,000 to 7,000 years ago, this is a period of warmer and wetter summers than before. The winters are less severe. It's becoming quite a bit easier to live, if you will. The forests are developing. They're comparable to today's modern fauna, increasing riverine productivity. Again, these are hunting and gathering communities, but we begin to see with these people the heavy woodworking tools, axes, adzes, gouges, that are thought to be largely for the production of canoes, dugout canoes, mashun, like the one that was made wonderfully by Jonathan Perry for the Little Compton Historical Society this summer. We begin to see the tools that seem to be associated with that kind of heavy woodworking activity at about this period of time. And we begin to see more and more in other parts of New England a coastal focus, with some of the first formal cemeteries, all of these things suggesting territories to which people are coming back and where their ancestors are being interred and are linking them to that piece of land. And we see an increase in site numbers across most of New England, not so much, a little bit more than we saw in the early Archaic here in the Sakonnet region, but also moving on, we see things appearing now along the Westport River as well in other areas. Again, a heavy focus on areas around wetlands, like around what's now the Watson Reservoir, or on the edge of the Wilbur Woods region. And again, this is Narragansett Bay. You can see a vast number of increase in the number of known Middle Archaic Neville Horizon sites. And as we add what we now know from the Sakonnet region to that, we begin to see that this is actually an important area within that overall Middle Archaic lifestyle. And you can see also from where the yellow shorelines have moved, by this point, 7 to 6,000 BC, finally, places like Block Island are actually islands. And if we go back a little bit into the previous period, you can see it was not in the early Archaic. So we're beginning to see in the early Archaic, the area, the deep water shore area offshore from Newport was beginning to be an inlet of the sea. By this period, that's stretching farther up into the Prudence Island area, and the shoreline is beginning to come close to where we expect it to be now. But it's still a very different landscape, and even at this point, the shoreline was a mile or two offshore from where you know it now, and 50 to 70 feet below where it is now. So sea level rise was extremely important, and it means also that if there were a lot of coastal settlements along those old shorelines, they're now deeply underwater and will be hard to find, but there is work underway to try to think about that. And so here we are here. From this point on, there's so many sites across the Narragansett Basin that I don't have those larger sites, but In the late Archaic, about 4,000 to 2,500 BC, 7,000, 4,500 years ago, there's an increased number of sites and of locations around Sakonnet that relate to this point, and a very diverse range of diagnostic stone tools. Brewerton or Laurentian pieces at the bottom there, unlabeled, those two pieces, those would have been the types of objects people were making at the time that copper axe was brought to this area, as well as a vast number of these small stemmed and triangular squibnocket, Wading River, Bear Island, Poplar Island, Lamoka points that are all called part of the small stemmed point tradition. And occasionally, what we see for the most part over this period of time is increasing use of local materials, dense settlement, many more objects than we've ever seen before up to this point in time. All of them have been used to assume that this is a period of massive population increase, but the heavy reliance on local stone types suggests that these are populations that are very tightly constrained to their area, very focused on local resources. On the other hand, as that axe that we saw before that comes from the Lake Superior Basin, and the point up at the top here, which is a Norman skill point made out of Norman skill chert from the Hudson River Valley, there's also evidence of continued connectivity between these areas and distant areas around. This is a period when the climate would have been like today's. The shorelines begin to be near local areas, and we begin to get a sense from the archaeological work that's been done in the paleoenvironmental area that as shorelines stabilized, you began to get dense beds of eelgrass and other seaweed off the shore that began to develop to the ways we see them now, that allow these to be the beds in which shad and alewives and herring, many other fish and shellfish live, which means that the rivers would have become more productive. And especially shad, alewives, and herring are fish that migrate up the rivers, as most of you know, in the early spring, a time when, if you were a hunting and gathering community, many of the resources that you had been able to store from acorns and other nuts in the fall would be getting low. In a bad year, you would be thinking about starving. So having those spring fish coming up the rivers, this would have been the ability to stabilize your economy and make sure you didn't starve, is probably one of the reasons why we begin to see evidence of dense populations, semi-sedentary villages, shell middens, which largely in the 19th century were quarried and used to put on the fields to sweeten the fields in acid soil areas, but those were the massive areas where big villages, big communities had lived for long periods of time. There's evidence of net fishing and coastal weirs. For example, in Boston, up in Boylston Street, when they were doing the Big Dig and other projects back in the early 20th century, they found evidence of massive weirs for fishing, basically for attaching nets to and driving fish into these fences along the shoreline, dating to this period of time around 5,000 years ago. So a really dynamic period of time, well represented in the Sakonnet region. And again, this is showing us that there is, in this period of time, interconnection with other groups across the eastern United States, as far into the Great Lakes as you can go. This is followed by another period of change, which is called the Terminal Archaic, or sometimes the Transitional Period. We're talking 4,500 to 3,000 years ago, climate similar, shoreline almost exactly at the current levels. And this is a period of considerable change, in particular in the projectile point styles and the areas that we see connections to. All of these points on the left-hand side, this is the full sequence of what's called the Susquehanna tradition or the Broad Spear tradition. These begin to be seen around 4,500 to 5,000 years ago in South Carolina. And these types of points spread all the way north through New England up into the Maritimes and in smaller numbers as far as southern Labrador. It's not clear whether this is representing a new population migrating into the area and taking over, whether these are emblems of social status, whether they're just really good tools that everyone picked up on. But there's a period of real change here that goes on, and also a strengthening of relationships, instead of, like we saw in the late Archaic, westward from here across into the Great Lakes, instead an interaction zone that really focuses on the Atlantic coastal zone from the Appalachians east and from South Carolina all the way to the maritime connections. There's increased mortuary ceremonialism, more sedentism, but in Tiverton, in Sakonnet, in the Sakonnet region, there are relatively fewer sites. Although, as I said, if some of those little white small stem points really are from this period, we may be misrepresenting this here. It's also the period when we see the first inorganic vessels, that is, steatite bowls. Before this time, there were no ceramics. We know that people had to be boiling things in things, but it's almost certainly everything was organic. Wooden bowls, wooden trenchers, skins, birch bark. Obviously, we're missing 90% of the material culture of these people. But at this point, we begin to see steatite bowls. Most of those bowls are quarried, at least the ones that are locally found, in 3, 4, maybe 5 different quarries on the western side of Narragansett Bay. And that material was being exchanged all the way down into the area around Maryland, Northern Virginia, Pennsylvania. So there's a lot of interaction going on through this period of time. And again, here's just showing you, depending on how you do this, this is either a period of decline or a period which is an upcline, which is a rise up in population or numbers of objects found. Around 1000 BC, 3000 years ago, we shift into what is called the early woodland. For many, many years, it was thought that this was a period of time with the beginning of agriculture, because it is the time when you see the first ceramic vessels. And it was assumed, based on models that came ultimately out of the Near East, that agriculture, ceramic vessels, and sedentism all came at the same time. We now know that's not the case. We do know that this is a period in the Northeast when you see the first pottery being made. And those steatite vessels, which preceded them, in some parts of the Northeast, we see them then being crushed up and used as the grit, as the temper in the earliest ceramic vessels. We have not yet seen any ceramics of this period in Sakonnet. As I say, most of the collectors have not been picking up ceramics, which often are the same color as the soil when you're walking over a field. There does seem to be, however, not only in Sakonnet, but across New England and over much of the eastern United States or the Northeast, a really significant decrease in site numbers. And also we see it here, a decrease in the number of objects found in local collections. The decrease is so noticeable and it is so extensive that there are a number of explanations for what it is. I would say not the consensus, but the view that most people seem to have is that this may be a real drop in populations across the Northeast. For what reason, we don't know. If it is the case, it could be pandemic, it could be epidemic, it could be any number of things, but there is something significant going on. It is also possible that we're missing some of the kinds of tools that we would see, that the communities at that time made less use of chipped stone tools, although we see no real evidence of that in the early woodland sites that are excavated. They seem to have the same number of stone tools as in previous ones compared to other materials. So it's unclear, but there's a significant decrease, and we can see that here in Sakonnet as well. At the same time, however, there's evidence that these people were connected through a series of networks that are thought to relate to mortuary ceremonialism, to religion, that were sweeping through the East from the Midwest and the Great Lakes region to the Atlantic coast. So when we see here Orient fishtail points at the bottom, those are really the dominant stone tools made out of local material, and the Rossville points at the top in the early woodland through this region. The meadowwood points, almost all of them are made from a type of flint that comes from the area around Buffalo, New York. They were made there by the thousands and traded through exchange networks all the way through the Northeast, and are frequently found not only in habitation sites, but also in caches and occasionally in burials. And that goes from about 1000 AD to about 500 AD, after which we begin to see ones like the top one above that. The lagoon point is made out of local material, and it's clearly a local imitation of these Adena points, which are related to the beginning of the big mound building civilizations of the Midwest. And we even find these Adena points here in local collections made out of Midwestern material. But in this case, we know that these were found by the collectors at specific local locations. So we're getting the sense, again, of real connections across a distant area, but also of some significant drastic decrease in population at the time. And whether these connections to other areas are because of changes in the ways in which people can move or because of responses to crisis is really something that needs to be thought about down the line. This is followed about 250 BC to 1050 BC by what we call, really uncreatively, the Middle Woodland period, where we see an slight increase in numbers of sites across New England and of artifacts in local collections. And in particular, you can see here an increased focus, although it's a small number of sites, around the coastal margins of the Sakonnet region. This is a period of time when there's a lot of use of local materials, but also the series of shared styles and the movement of what we would call exotic raw materials, again, coming from more than 200 miles away, that are revealing networks that in this case expand upon what we had seen in the earlier periods and connect a network that goes all the way from southern Labrador down into the mid-Atlantic area and into the Chesapeake Bay region. We've seen here locally these different type point styles. Here you can see there's that yellow jasper point on the right near the bottom, which we know comes from Pennsylvania, from the Hardyston jasper quarries. And on the right, you can see a couple of pendants that came out of sites in southern parts of Little Compton. These notched ends on them are almost identical to pendants or gorgets that are found at sites in the Chesapeake Bay region in Maryland, Virginia, southern Pennsylvania, and at sites between there. The pottery that you can see at the bottom with that on the bottom left, over on the right-hand side, with that zigzaggy material made with a scallop shell that gets put back and forth, create these designs. We see those being used, again, all the way from the Chesapeake region to central New York State and up into this area. So a period of really intense connection, the beginnings of fairly sedentary societies, more increased use of pottery, but also intense use of local raw materials. And perhaps, it's not quite clear in New England yet, but this may be when we really begin to see the beginnings of horticultural activity, of agricultural activity, certainly of the manipulation and gathering and potentially protection of certain plants as a regular part of the diet. Getting to the end of the sequence, we see the late woodland period. And this brings us up to that period that we tend to all think about when we think about Native American, when the Europeans arrived, beginning about 1000 AD. And in the Sakonnet region, there had been the presumption, based on records from King Philip's War, talking about how people would go into the swamps to protect themselves. There has been an assumption that the swamps were the central places of settlement. And we can see archaeologically that from the early Archaic up through the terminal Archaic, that was the truth. That was the case. Those areas were the real supermarkets. Those were the best places to live. But this isn't the case at all in the late woodland period, where we see no focus of settlement along those areas. The occasional object, very few compared to other periods of time. But these we know from other archaeological work are fully agricultural communities. And where we're seeing evidence of these sites up around Nonquit Pond and that area, and down along the western shore of Little Compton, these are the areas of the richest agricultural soil, the easiest manipulated soil, even to the present day. And that's where we're really seeing them. It's also interesting, although these are not archaeological sites we investigated, this is a period when we see petroglyphs showing up along the shoreline, not far from that big cluster around Almy Creek, and Squant Rock, of course, down on Lloyd's Beach. So there's evidence as well of marking of sacred sites in this area, as well as intense settlement. But it is interesting that the area of most intense settlement seems to be in the north, around southern Tiverton, to which I would say there is a caveat, because that is the area to which almost every collector goes all the time and where collections are made the most heavily. The other parts of Little Compton have been walked over far less frequently. And so we may simply not know what's there. And that's why we talk about collector bias, not that they are biased against things, but that there is a focus in areas where people know that people have found things before. People tend to go back and forth over and over again. The other thing that we see at this point, if you look at the Levana points on the side, is that they are uniform. This is really considered to be the first real arrow points in the whole history of Eastern North America. And they all have, and what we're seeing consistently is the use of black stone or dark gray stone at the top, a reddish brown stone in the middle. Really, it's bright red when you quarry it up from around Attleboro, and white stones at the bottom. It's a really significant change. And we see it here. If we compare the types of stone, the colors of stone that were used in the middle woodland on the left-hand side here, with the triangles representing quarries that we know and the colors of stone found in them. So we have, in the area, we've got black stone, red stone, green stone, brown stone, white stone, gray stone. And in the middle woodland, they're using a lot of that, but they're also importing a lot of this yellow and red jasper from areas to the southwest. Very colorful, if you will, assemblages. On the right, what we see as soon as the late woodland period begins and right up to the contact period, all of those colors, all of the green, all of the yellow, all of the brown, most of the light gray disappears. And everywhere you go across the Narragansett Basin and farther out, it is just the white, the red, the black. This is a really significant change and seems to be unique to this area, or it may need to be investigated further. It probably has to do, and again, here we've got our local sites flying in. It may well have to do with the color symbolism triad that it was known for the Eastern coastal Algonquian peoples and the Iroquoian peoples in the 17th and 18th centuries, in which white represents many of the social aspects of life, peace, well-being, law, power, black, the asocial aspects of death, mourning, solemnity, authority, and war, action, emotion, and antisocial activities being red. This is a really significant color triad. And I suspect that what we're seeing in the late woodland here is the emergence either of the confederacies we later know as the Narragansett and the Wampanoag, or of a real change in the political signaling that's used in arrow points and what they mean and why you choose just these three colors to represent pieces that you go to war with, that you hunt with, or that you potentially give each other as symbols of alliance. And again, yellow disappears. That's disorder, sickness, and bile for many of the Eastern woodlands cultures. At the very end of this, we saw surprisingly little in local collections that related to the contact period. We thought we would see more, especially with King Philip's War, and because this is more recent. It may be because our call for people to bring collections in really focused on stone tools, and they begin to drop out at this point in time. And it may be due to the fact that there's a very short period of time here, or that some of the Levana points that characterize the late woodland were probably made into the late mid-17th century. We did, on the other hand, find we were brought in a 17th century copper alloy arrow point from the western part of Little Compton that I showed you before, and from the area around the Pease Field, a 17th century English gun spall of a type that we know were being made in the Plymouth colony at that time. Again, these focus in that same area around the mouth of Albany Creek, which we know was a central part of the settlement zone in the late woodland period, but these don't really stretch out as far as the areas that Marjorie has been able to document were territories, were possessions, and were properties owned by the Sakonnet people in the 18th century and the 17th century. So to wrap it up, what did we learn? We learned that Little Compton's history spans at least 11,500, probably 13,500 years, not just 350. We were able to document the complete sequence of that time, including periods that are rarely documented in Southeast New England and types of stone tools which are rarely seen. And thanks to all of the collectors that let us look at their material, Without them, we would never have seen that. We're able to see notable changes through time in the areas that were most heavily utilized. We were able to map out, as you see in this map on the right, a much richer sense of the archaeological distribution of sites, with each of those squares and circles representing materials from different collections from different time periods in specific locations. And some of them are really densely represented. So as I say, some areas of dense records of past occupation. We can see that wetlands and swamps were focal areas of settlement, were used from the early Archaic through the late Archaic or terminal Archaic, but that these were not central areas of settlement during the late Woodland and Contact period, as settlers' views might have suggested and contemporary people have thought. And we can also see that colonial and contemporary land use patterns, as well as collections preferences for certain locations, really are affecting our understanding of earlier patterns of land use in some parts of the town. For example, the eastern part of Little Compton, the eastern part of Tiverton, where most of the land is in pasture or woodland, there's probably a rich archaeological record there, but we're just not seeing it because of the way people collect. We're now able to start setting Sakonnet's history within broader temporal and regional patterns. Again, by looking at this map and untangling it from the different colors like I did before, we can see changes in where people were living through time. And we can also see, as we begin to look at the patterns through time, we see that these spikes really are real, and they also fit into what's known from other parts of southeastern New England. And not in other parts of New England. So we can begin to see periods of time that were really important and in which the people of Sakonnet were interacting and were participating in whatever these changes mean. We have been able to show that Sakonnet's communities were never isolated, and they maintained long-distance contacts across eastern North America long before Europeans arrived. We're starting to see major changes at the local level. Like I say, this shift in one example, the shift in the late Woodland period to a total change in selection of the type of stones used that clearly had meaning. Why those colors? Why not others? And probably relates to the rise of political confederations in this time, like those we knew at the time Europeans arrived. In terms of outcomes, hopefully we help to expand the Little Compton Historical Society's interpretive mission from 350 to as much as 13,500 years. We provided the Historical Society and collectors, we hope, with more accurate understandings of their collections, help to improve the Historical Society's management of their archaeological collections by helping to increase the documentation they have and giving advice on how they might best be stored. We're able to suggest as well whether any of objects in the Historical Society's collections might be subject to repatriation and ongoing discussions with the Native communities about that. And I think it provides us with new avenues of community engagement through which the Historical Society's collections have grown and partners have been identified for upcoming and future exhibitions. Opportunities that come from it, I hope, are that there are new avenues for working with Native communities to tell the 13,500-year history of the people of Sakonnet through their own voices. I want to reiterate that the way I have interpreted as an archaeologist is just one way of seeing this past. And the ways in which members of our local communities, Native communities, who have deep oral histories and understandings of the past, by merging these, we're going to get a richer and more interesting understanding of the past and the ways in which people understand the past, which may be different than what really happened in the past, but it's all telling the story of this region. There are also, we've shown additional possibilities how to link the history of the Sakonnet region into broader pre-colonial histories at a subcontinental scale across the eastern United States. And we've provided, I think we can provide a database framework for revising past errors in the ways the history of the Sakonnet people before Europeans have been perceived and presented. And through that, there are opportunities to break down pre-existing stereotypes of isolation or of Native people living in a timeless past without change. This provides, hopefully, the Historical Society with increased abilities to answer common questions that their visitors will bring in and to refute common misperceptions and misunderstandings about who lived here before the English arrived and for how long. The Historical Society is hopefully able to expand its way of talking about this in ways that go beyond what is being provided to schools and the popular media, which I teach courses at Bridgewater State these days, and the students there who arrive know nothing about the past before Europeans arrived, if they even know when Europeans arrived. It's really important that we get this information out there to kids and to others. And there are possibilities here for engaging the public with material evidence about the indigenous presence, change, persistence, and resistance that encourage them to understand the broader histories of indigenous survival and revival across New England and in the land specifically of the Sakonnet people. And I mention the material evidence because for many of our visitors who come from a Western philosophical perspective, the materiality, the reality of seeing something of that period of time means something more than hearing someone talk about oral history. Hopefully that perspective will change and we'll be able to appreciate both. But the material evidence, which is what museums and historical societies rely on, you've got it now in your hands. So I wanted to thank all of you for your time, to the community members in Little Compton and the Sakonnet region who shared their collections. I wanted to thank Charlotte Taylor at the State Archaeologist and the Rhode Island Historical Preservation Heritage Commission for sharing their information. And finally, many, many thanks to Marjorie O'Toole, to Christine Gagnon Aguiar, all the staff board members and their Indigenous advisors at the Little Compton Historical Society for all their support of this project, and all of you for staying on and listening. And with that, I'd like to end and just open it up to questions if there are any.
Kevin, I'm just going to chime in. Thank you. That was an outstanding presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Some of you may know that we will be publishing a book this spring about the history of the Sakonnet people. Kevin is going to have a chapter in that book, which I'm going to say it's going to reflect his talk tonight in many ways. And it's a marvelous and quite necessary, I think, addition to that publication. So I have been looking forward to the talk, love the talk, and now I'm going to look forward to Kevin's chapter. But I do encourage you to please put your questions for Kevin in the chat. And we do have time for a few questions. We don't want to monopolize Kevin's time tonight. I'm going to start the questions with, could you please explain to the audience what repatriation is?
You chose a really quick one. Repatriation in a legal framework means the return of belongings, significant belongings to Native communities. In the United States, any museum that receives federal funding, any project that receives federal funding, is subject to the regulations and to the processes established through the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 and all of its later revisions and guidelines. It does not require the return, legal return, of all objects. It's a law that I think, like most laws, satisfies no one in all of its aspects, but moves forward in a particular way. And under NAGPRA, what are objects that are required to be consulted with and potentially to be repatriated if the community requests them are human remains, objects found in association with human remains, objects that are known to have only been used in cemetery, in grave, in mortuary contexts, even if the human remains are not present or have been lost or were separated. Sacred objects that are needed for use in a contemporary, continuing religious tradition in Native communities, and what are called patrimonial objects, which the classic example of that, if it were an American society, would be the US Constitution, something that represents the entire community and cannot be alienated by one person and voided by one person, even if he wants to. or in the case of many a classic example are the wampum belts that were used as to represent the treaties and the relationships of the entire community, and which represent. So those are the options. And there's a long process which involves consultation with the Native communities. Some Native communities in some parts of the United States are trying to bring as much back as they can because it's very important for community stability and for community healing. In some other parts of the United States, there are objects which have been, say, sacred objects which were removed or sold at some point, and for which there is no ritual process for bringing them back into the community because it was never considered possible. So if you've desecrated something, uh, the people in Zuni and the Navajo, for example, are having a lot of concern about that because there's objects that there's no ritual, there's no process for bringing things back which are considered so spiritually powerful that they could be dangerous to the community because they've been disrespected and taken away. Does that help? Okay.
Kevin, we had two questions that were
Yeah.
both, they were interrelated. So
Okay.
we have one person who, Chris Martin said that he has recently started a collection in the last year and was wondering if we were going to be doing any more community outreach days. And then I think that it was Nick who brought in a great question of, if I find something, what do I do with it?
Whether we're going to do more community outreach days and look at more of the collections, I think I would love to do it. I find it very wonderful, but that's a question really for Marjorie and the board, and
I think we might be able to do one more day
okay.
before the book deadline,
Okay.
so that if something weird shows up, we can write about that. But
I
if
think
Kevin's willing, we'll probably try to schedule one more day.
Yeah, and once we
Only
get,
for objects found in Little Compton and the close borders to Little
Mhm.
Compton.
Mhm, mhm. And the question of what you should do if you find an object. If I want to be a strict archaeologist, I would say leave it where it is. But if on the other hand, you know that it's going to be, the property is being destroyed, disturbed, it's going to disappear anyway, then the obvious best thing to do is to record where you found it, make a record of that, link it to the object specifically, keep a journal. These days we can take a photograph of everything. We can get GPS coordinates on our phone. So that, and then keep those things together. Ideally, find a museum or an organization that is willing to take those on so that the records, the object, and all of that stay together. The real shame and the problem that has happened in so much of the Eastern United States, in so much of the world really, is that many people have very ethically made collections in as ethical and as respectful a way as they can, as they knew how to do. And there are all different perspectives on whether collecting should be done, should not be done. But if it is done, and if something is found, we have the question of what to do with it. So many collections that were made in the past, the person who made them didn't record where they were from, or they did, and they had that in a notebook someplace, and they had all of their objects someplace else. They pass away, their heirs have no interest in it. They get either thrown away or they get sold on eBay, and the finite record of what happened in these places in the past disappears, and it gets spread around, and those objects no longer have any way of being connected to where they were found, or to the histories of those regions. So there's a cost in labor, time, etc., to any institution that takes them on. But some institutions are willing to do that, and I would encourage, if you can, provide a way to get them to an institution that will protect them and preserve them so that the record is maintained, that's great. If you can't, at the very least, keep a record of where you found it, a photograph of what it is, link those things together so that these don't just simply become objects like some of my friends who I knew in central Pennsylvania growing up would take the objects because I made really good skipping stones and skip them down the river, or they get sold on eBay. There's an ethical responsibility to collecting, just like there's an ethical responsibility if you're an archaeologist. And I think it's good people recognize that, especially when you realize that what you're collecting are the makings and belongings of the ancestors of people who still live here and who may not be your ancestors. So you are working with somebody else's heritage, and that gives you an important right and necessity to treat it with respect, not as something which is, just fun stuff to pick up.
I think that might be it for questions. Charlotte
Okay.
Taylor also says the information can be sent to the State Preservation Office.
Yep.
Collectors find artifacts in places where the state can't require archaeology, so they fill in the blank spots. We at the Preservation Office love to get that information.
Yep.
Thank you
Sorry,
so
Charlotte,
much,
I should have
Kevin.
said that right up front.
This was, as I said earlier, I'd been looking forward to this talk for more than a year now, and you didn't disappoint. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. I've enjoyed working with all of you, and I hope to do more of it down the line. And I can't wait to see the exhibit.
Great. Again, thank you all for spending the evening with us. Special thanks to Kevin. And do tune in to our social media, ask to join our mailing list, and Kevin and I will figure out a community collection assessment day. I'm going to say let's shoot for February. I don't know Kevin's schedule, but we'll talk soon and we'll share that with the public.
Perfect.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks.